All right, so let's talk about what this CRAAP test is and how we're going to use it for our various sources. With the acronym, the first thing is that C, and C is just referring to current. Think about like the word current affairs. It just means, is it a recent piece of work? So that's what you're looking at for that first question here. Was it written recently enough to be accurate? Check the date on things. Check the date on websites. Check the date on news articles. Check the date on websites, because usually at the bottom of the website, if it's a legitimate source, it should say at the bottom the last time it was updated. Or copyrighted and things like that. That gives you an idea of how old that information is. This isn't a make or break kind of thing when it comes to deciding if something is a relevant source or not relevant source, but it is something that you should factor in. The other thing you should be asking yourself when you're checking for currency is, has it been revised or updated? So you might find some information that was from 10 years ago, and then you might do some research to see, do you have that same information again like 5 years ago or 2 years ago? So that way you can see, how has that information been updated since the original article. The thing you have to remember about science is that we are constantly trying to learn new information, and we're always adjusting our viewpoints with that new information. And so that's why you don't want to take something that's really, really old. You want to see what the most up-to-date research is. That's going to be really important for vaping, because vaping is a relatively new thing that has happened. And so we don't have a long scientific history of the impacts of vaping. We're only getting this information now. So back when I was in high school, vaping wasn't a thing. You would just smoke. And we obviously have lots of long-term data about how smoking affects us, because people have been smoking for hundreds of years. Vaping is a more recent thing, and before there's statements that are out there that say it's a safer alternative, it's safe, yada, yada, yada. But now that we have more long-term data, we can actually see if it actually has long-term effects and long-term harm. It also is a matter of, do we have the data? Have we had enough time just to process and do those experiments? So it's really important to check if that information has been revised or updated, because like I said, science is constantly building on itself. So that's why I would say look out for that. Building on itself. There's a lot of unanswered questions in science, and so we still keep asking questions so we can get more information. And whenever we get this new information, we then change what our beliefs and understanding are. The other thing you can check is, are the links still working on the website? So that's something else just to check to make sure that this website is being updated and things like that. Are we good so far? So that's the C. That one's generally pretty easy to tell. If something doesn't have a date on it, then you can question whether or not it's a reliable source, because you would expect websites to update the information. So do double check that. The next thing here is the R, which is relevant. So with this one here, you're saying, does the information relate to your topic or your question? What you want to be careful of when you're looking at scientific information, or whenever you're trying to make any sort of argument, is you want to make sure that you're to the point and you're providing data that actually makes sense to your point of view. If it's not relevant, then you're going off at a tangent, or you're going off down a rabbit hole. And so you want to make sure that whatever you're doing is right and makes sense to what you're trying to do. You can see some of the bias stuff that we were talking about earlier come into the relevant. Who is the intended audience is coming up again. Again, that's going to skew how they might communicate the information. And the other thing you can check is other sources to make sure it's the most relevant to your topic. So for example, if you're doing research and you're writing about the dangers of vaping, it would be irrelevant to talk about smoking, because it's two different can of worms, unless you were trying to do some compare and contrast to make a point. Does that make sense to people so far? The other thing I like to put into the relevance question is it a question that science can answer? Or is it a question that science can easily answer? And that can help you think if that is a relevant piece of information, or if it's kind of like, I think the word I was going to write down for you is anecdotal. Let me see. Or maybe I was thinking about putting anecdotal somewhere else. Let me check my scribbles. No, that's where I want. So we can ask ourselves, is it an easy science question that we can answer? For example, we can ask the question, which concentration causes the magnesium to react the fastest? That is a scientific question. I can do an experiment and get that answer. A non-scientific question would be something like, yellow is the best color. Because you can't quantify that, you can't measure it. Another thing that you can think about, I wrote easily answer. So for example, like we were talking about the other day, the misinformation about vaccines causing autism. Now, that is actually not an easy question for science to answer when it comes to autism, because we know that autism is caused by multiple different things. It could be genetics, it could be environment. So to just say it's that one thing and it's a direct link is really hard for us to answer. Does that make sense so far? The other thing you can check with relevance is the information anecdotal? Make sure I spell anecdotal. You guys know what anecdotal means? No? So it means that you're providing information that's kind of like a story. So it's like one individual person's experience instead of it being actual scientific data. So like if I wanted to explain that smoking is bad, I might talk about my friend Iris's parents, who both passed away before she was 21, both through complications of long-term smoking. Now, yes, that is evidence that smoking is dangerous, but it's anecdotal evidence. It's just a story. It's not data. So that's something else you should be aware of when you are looking at sources. Ask yourself, did they actually do an experiment, or are they just telling me this one-off experience? Are we okay with that so far? All right. Just making sure it focuses for you guys. Okay, I'm just going to move it over again. The next thing that we see is authoritative as our second A. So authoritative, we are asking the question, who wrote it, who published it, how is it being publicized? So that's really important. There should be an author on a lot of work. If there's no author and they're hiding behind a fake username, or they just have a generic website with no one being tied to that responsibility of that information, then it's less kind of valid as a source. So keep that in mind. So you're thinking, oh, sorry, I'll keep going. The other thing is what makes the author an expert. So what you should do is Google the people or the institution that's provided the source. Check if that source is valid. So you could Google the person to see, do they actually know what they're talking about? Are they backed by an institution, say like a university or an institute? So are they backed by the Ministry of Health? Are they backed by the University of Auckland? Or are they just some random? And if they are not backed by an institution, is it a primary source? So what you're going to need to be asking yourself when you're looking at authoritative is you're thinking about, do you have it from, say, for example, Science is an example of a publisher that is a scientific article, like a scientific magazine. Is it produced by someone like News Hub? That sort of stuff. So National Geographic. Those are examples of scientific kind of publications. Is it from, say, for example, News Hub or Stuff? Is it from the University of Auckland? Does that make sense so far? So check where that is from. Primary source is an interesting term that you should be also mindful of. Primary source means that you are looking at the publisher who has done the experiment. So a primary source has done the experiment. And these are often scientific journals. So scientific journals would be stuff like National Geographic, Science, that sort of stuff. Cell is another big kind of journal article. We good so far? Okay. A secondary source is the reporting of the primary. And this is often for the common public. So for example, things that are the secondary sources would be things like News Hub and Stuff. So News Hub and Stuff would publish publish information from primary sources, but they're going to reword it and present it for the general public so that way it's less scientific. Well, not less scientific. Yeah, less scientific actually. It's probably not going to have the same depth and complexity of the language and the scientific information and processing because they are writing to people that may not be as scientifically literate, whereas the primary source will be writing intended for other scientists to read and process that information. So it's not a bad thing that things are secondary sources because it's making science accessible to the rest of the public. But you have to remember that secondary sources might try to sensationalize an article. So for example, a secondary source might say that eating chocolate doubles your risk of cancer. But when you go look at the primary source of information, the change could be like 0.002% to like 0.004%. So that's technically a doubling, but it's such a small doubling that people wouldn't pay attention to it. Whereas News Hub or Stuff or some other kind of general secondary source might want to sensationalize the article and say it doubles because that sells more newspapers and more ads and things like that. So you got to be careful. And so when you're seeing secondary sources reference things, look up the original source to see, is it actually doubling and causing a big major problem? Are we okay with that? Next idea. Keep going? Yeah? Okay. Then you should be asking for the second A, is it accurate? So accuracy is talking about supporting evidence. So have they referenced other journal articles and trying to make their own experiment? You're supposed to do that. Has it been reviewed by experts and fact checkers? When things get published in primary sources like Science and National Geographic, they're going to be people that are reading the science, they'll be picking it apart, they'll be asking questions before they publish it. So that has actually gone through a peer review process. Other sources wouldn't have done that. So that's why you want to check to see where is it coming from. Simple things like, are there spelling errors or just like weird punctuation errors? That's not proper publication. Someone obviously doesn't have the literacy skills and it's not being checked by anyone. The other thing to think about is, what are the other experts saying about it? So what you should be doing for your checking your accuracy is you should be reading a wide range of information. And when you read a wide range of information, you'll be able to know, do I see a consistent pattern in what is being said? Or is this an outlier? So what are others saying about it is an important thing. You should be asking yourself that question. So it's basically just saying that information should be repeatable or results should be repeatable. So other people should see that thing. The other thing we can talk about when it comes to accuracy is thinking about the experiment itself, if you're looking at primary sources. So if you guys remember, you can check the method in primary sources. So do you guys remember some of the things you thought about as like important things for your biology experiments? Sample size, you remember that? And why do we want sample size to be large? Do you remember? Why did you do the experiment 3 times? To get an average. So we should see when we're looking at our data that they have a large sample size. Now, obviously 3 is the bare minimum. So we should realistically see in good scientific articles like a large sample size, like 100 or 50 or something like that. The other thing you can check is, I'm just trying to see where I wrote down all my notes. It's a little annoying. Ah, there it is, sample size. Check how many dependent variables they have. Now, you guys are used to only measuring 1, but good science articles will measure more than 1. So that's why I put an S here. When I did my master's, to double check if the drugs that I was using caused toxicity, I think I had 4 different endpoints that I was measuring. And the reason why I was measuring 4 different dependent variables was because they would back each other up. If I had a problem in one, I should have a problem in all of them. So that you should measure multiple endpoints. You can have multiple dependent variables, but you should only have 1 independent variable. You should only change 1 thing at a time. Is that okay? Yeah. Other thing to watch for is a control sample. It's helpful to know if something is the null, or what would happen in normal conditions. Also check their control variables. Did they actually only test 1 thing? Now there's going to be instances where controlling for everything is going to be really, really hard, especially when you're working with human population. But they want to be able to control as much as possible. The other thing you should be checking for a lot of these studies is it a blind study? Have you guys heard of blind study? Do you guys know what a blind study is? Have you guys ever heard of the placebo effect? No? Yes, it's kind of sounding familiar. Phoenix, do you want to explain what you kind of understand about placebo effect?
The placebo effect is when the brain is tricked to think that they are affected in a way that they're not. Like if you gave someone juice and said you've been spiked, if they start like they have been spiked.
Perfect. Yeah, that's exactly it. So the placebo effect is you think that you are getting a response when in fact you were given the null nothing sample. So for example, if someone's doing a test and they're trying to test a new drug, they should have a control group that has not been exposed to the drug, but they shouldn't tell the control group that they're the control group. Because if they tell the control group that they're the control group and the test group that they're the test group might think that they have reactions to things because they're like, ooh, I'm taking the drug, so I must be having this reaction. So that's what the placebo effect is. So when you blind the study, you don't tell people if they are the control or if they're the test subject, and then they can more genuinely report the effects of a drug. We're good so far? All right. Last one is the purpose of that information. So think about why that information was created. I'm going to try to get up a different color. Are they trying to promote something? If you guys remember looking at the Fluoride-Free New Zealand website the other day, you notice how there was a donation on the side of that website. So that tells me there's an alternative purpose to some of that information they're giving, because they're trying to sell stuff, sell ad space, get more money for their charity, that sort of thing. The other thing it could be is to drive votes and things like that. Which again comes up because you can vote for counselors and whether or not they're going to fluorinate the water. Is the purpose clear? And then what bias do you find? What are others saying about the author is a really useful thing to think about, and about the source. So for example, we talked a little bit about Andrew Wakefield the other day, how he was the scientist that first proposed the link between autism and vaccines. Some people obviously hold him very highly, and a lot of people, the vast majority of the scientific community, don't. And in fact, he has lost his medical license and been kicked out of the Royal Society of Science. So what does that then say about the information that he's putting out there? So these are things you got to check for. And then, what is your own purpose? What is your own bias? Because that can influence what you're seeing and doing. All right, any questions about that so far? So you have that little half piece of paper to hopefully kind of keep next to you when you guys are doing little CRAAP tests. We will practice this by watching a video about the dangers of science, misinformation or something like that. So that way you guys can have a chance to kind of practice this and also learn more about why it's important to know about validity of sources. So let me stop that recording. All right, so now we're gonna practice the CRAAP test with this video here from Michael Spector. Now, some things we can do before we start watching the video and helping us begin that CRAAP test is we can check the date that this video was uploaded, and I can see that it says February 24th, 2013. So it is almost about 10 years old. So we can keep that in mind with the currency. In fact, it probably should be updated because we know there's a lot more information out there when it comes to science denier, because it's probably gotten worse. The other thing we should be looking at is who's putting out this information. So we see that it is a TED Talk. Now, have you guys heard of TED Talks before? Yeah. Do you think the TED Talk presenters are usually pretty onto it? Yeah, so it's coming from a reputable source. I can see that already. And the other thing I can check before we start is who Michael Spector is to make sure he is a relevant source. So if I click on his Wikipedia page real quick, I can see that he's an American journalist. I can see that he is focusing on science, technology, and global health. And he's written at the New Yorker. That's another magazine that is quite, it's not a scientific magazine, but it is a relevant magazine. He also has written for the Washington Post and the New York Times. So those I know are secondary sources of information, probably. So that helps me then think about, okay, how relevant is this information that he's talking about? He also talks about how he's a visiting lecturer and things like that. We can read up about his career and bio, but all that helps us decide if his information that he presents to us today relevant. So let's go through and watch this video because I think it's a good thing for us to see. Like I said, I'll start at 6 minutes in, and I want you guys to go through the CRAAP test as we are watching this.